Good morning. Now we are arriving to our third day. I hope you have slept well. I didn't, but as you see, now we are going to start with our, let's say, third day sessions. I'm very sorry for we made a commit a mistake. We didn't put the title let's say of the conference of Alda Benjamen, as I'm used to do, and I will continue doing it. I'm not going to underline her excellent literary production, her overwhelming career first as student and then as scholar. Alda, as you know, she is professor at the University of Berkeley. She was also appointed for an important project, as you mentioned, that was somehow supported and sponsored by Nineveh Chair, and especially Alda is a specialist in modern Assyrian history, focused concretely upon the Assyrian territory of today's Iraq. As you can see, she will talk about the Assyrians in modern Iraq. And I'm very, very happy having her here among us, because this is the way where we can, see, not just online or through Facebook, chatting and connecting, but this is a special occasion for us not only to talk to you, but also to share those values that we are fighting for. And the best way is doing it face to face. And Alda, at the beginning, she was a bit, she really said, Rabbi, if I can, I will come, I promise. Then she said, we don't know whether we can or not, but at the end, they are here with us, she and Danny, her husband. And she will talk about an important issue, because whether we want or not, our geographical area, which is wider than the modern Iraq, but the slight hope in the future to have a territory, as when Ashur started having its existence as a city-state, probably will have to recover such initiatives of 3000 BC in order to restart. So today, Alda, I'm not going to talk much more about your qualities as professor that are excellent, as a convinced Assyrian as well. Yesterday we underlined an important issue, and I firmly believe in it, that the female movement among the Assyrian community must be much more visible, must be much more involved in places where decision makers are somehow trying to do. So this is why I'm very happy having you here. I'm thankful to you to have done such an effort to come and to share your knowledge, your expertise, and especially upon a specific topic. Now the role is yours.
شلام عليكم قلمتكم برخطة وين شريمنا بلشان الديان ومدي قام يا رابي أفرميان دس اتلي خاي قرارو رابا جورد قام شهدت لي وتخنوخن ديزون ديرد أنا تنزلون من نوخن بوجتاوي جوها قامتا برسوبايد هم زميات بوك توكس دي هلادية بشتن شدها دكان بريشة إنها ما شوينا virtual سجى قامتا هم زمن من نوخن باتا إلى خاي قارا جورا قاتي أو تنباسي متضيرتون رابي أفرم تبقلي بيو شاون ترى الأسرة قيطة الأسرة خلولت خورة عزيزة قديان وخرت غزيلا ويدالة تبقلا بلومادة بخشاون خرتها ويوالد برلين لومادة تبقلا من ويدالة خاي قارة جورة قديان اتلا خبر سوبا مخ رابي أفرم يلدا زد إلى ربا بيولبانو جميرة بيولبانا رابا رخقة من أنا يوتا وأنا إنا خجمة كواليتي زد إنا أنا نقايا خبر سوبا ماصة مرخط خا كرسي أنا نقايا شمت ننوى جو خا دوجتا مخ بغزايتون إيوخ جاوا إلى خا مرمت الشمة قديان مجد أو بكل همانوتا بضاين بدعوامنتيانا مجشولة عود لرابي أفرم تهماشا جموي لقديان شروكي لقديان وبسناد لقديان قدي برسوفايت سنيدلة بضاين قرابة من نوخن دا أبزم سنيدلة سؤال باسيما رابي تشيدت قديان I will talk now in English about my book, which is written in English, so excuse me about that, but of course I will take your question and I won't say in any language. 3 languages are Assyrian, of course, Arabic, and English. So my book, Assyrians in Modern Iraq, Negotiating Political and Cultural Space, particularly covers the years 1960 to 1988. In our roundtable, in our roundtable yesterday, I sort of presented myself as being how I situate my work. I started off in Syriac studies. I have a master's degree in Syriac studies, but my PhD was in modern Middle Eastern studies, or history in particular, so I'm a historian. The terminology that I use, the way I situate my work on Assyrians, comes within that field. So when I engage with sources and describe my methodology, that is how I situate my work. And in particular, Iraqi studies within Middle Eastern, modern Middle Eastern studies. So the Assyrians, I don't think we need to describe them. We had 2 days talking about them, but I can happily talk about identity and how I describe it in the question and answer period. But during this time, 1960 to 1988, they began migrating from their historical towns and villages in the northern region of Iraq. Iraq has been formed, nation states have been formed for a few decades now, to urban centers. So this is the urbanization of the community within the modern nation state. Moving to larger Iraqi cities in search of modern professional employment, primarily in Iraq in the expanding oil industry. and also transportation, but also looking for better educational opportunities. Within these urban spaces, Assyrians became attracted to intellectual and political movements that allowed them to emerge from the peripheries of their society, temporarily discarding their minoritized status to engage with other Iraqis of their socioeconomic background. Now remember, of course, after the genocide, after the Simel massacre, the Assyrian nationalist political movement has been, it isn't what it is. It's been destroyed, in Iraq especially. So, their engagements are, given their socioeconomic status and such, within other Iraqi political groups, earlier in the study of my book. In these secular and often leftist political spaces, Assyrians found room to maneuver and form strategic alliances, both as individuals and as a community, in order to advance issues that were often beneficial to the community as a whole. So not only individually, but often it benefits a community. So what I will be doing is really giving you the major arguments of the book. It's difficult to talk about a project that took me about 10 years to complete. The book is based on my PhD dissertation that I edited and published recently in February 2022, so a couple of months ago. So I will not get into every single argument of this book, but I'll give you sort of an overview of it. So the significance of it, again, situating it within Middle Eastern, Iraqi, and also Assyrian studies, the book sheds light, a new light on the position of Assyrians and minorities, we can argue in general, in Iraqi oppositional parties and on their subsequent treatment by the state and its judicial institutions. So judicial meaning courts, police, and other state institutions. It explores the policies adopted by the early Ba'athist period, it came to power in 1968 in Iraq, and examines the Assyrian intellectual response to their being granted certain cultural rights in 1972. I argue that Ba'athist policies towards the Assyrians reflected the regime's response to both internal and external pressures. This argument, you can say that also extends to today, right? The policies, how they treat the Assyrians, has a lot to do with how a regime feels and the external and internal pressures on it. Internally, during this period, the opposition, activism of Assyrians, and their interactions with regional and international compatriots of Assyrians in Iran, in Syria, and in the diasporas, represented a concern for the government. And this is very clear in Ba'athist archives that we have. Externally, the influence of vocal, diasporic Assyrian communities on Western governments and human rights organizations resulted in negative publicity to the Ba'athist regime. So let me just show you a map. So the title of the book, this is the area of the Assyrians. My introduction deals with the World War I period to some extent, but then I move on to, of course, the second half of the 20th century. This is a map I created for this book. The chapters, the concentrations of the Assyrians are at this point in the north of the country. And, when I talk about the role of Assyrians in the opposition, you might say, well, how significant were they numerically? Were they really significant for the opposition? Now remember again the map where they're concentrated in the north, the proximity to Iran. Iran is funding the opposition. So geopolitically they're positioned in a good space. And also, this is a census, the best census arguably that we have for the country from 1957. The Turkmen community complained bitterly about these census. They said that our numbers are much larger. We can assume the Assyrian numbers were also larger. I know Assyrians from Nuhadra or Dahog tell me that they were much, much larger than what the numbers are in the census, but this is the best that we can work with. Now you can see that the very last column, percentage of Christians, this is how they're described in the census. They concentrate mostly in urban centers, in city centers, in the provinces. Mosul is the highest concentration at this time. Mosul is sort of similar to the Ottoman Mosul wilayat or province. Here. So it included Nuhadra or Duhok in Mosul in 1957. Duhok is not a province yet. So you can see the percentage, the total percentage of Christians, they're quite high. In Ahmadiyya you have about 24%, in Zakho 21%, in Sheikhan 17%. So the numbers are not very small, they're significant given their numbers, their concentration in the north to the opposition. So from a broader perspective, the intellectual and social movements explored in my book contribute to our understanding of leftist movements in the region of the 1960s. It seeks to shift the traditional academic focus from the center, Baghdad, to highlight relations between the center and the periphery, where Assyrians were active, the periphery being the provinces. And in particular, it deepens our understanding of provincial Iraqi history, since Assyrians engaged within leftist movements were active not only in urban centers, but often in rural areas as well. Moreover, given the Assyrians were concentrated in the north, I think a new story, or I've made an attempt to do this, a new story of the region has been told, one that complicates our understanding of the intricate relations between political actors, traditional tribal affiliations, and ethno-religious communities. A rich history is revealed of bilingualism and often multilingualism that challenges the idea of a monoglot Arabic-speaking population advanced by the Iraqi state and its associated intellectuals. Iraq, in fact, was multilingual, bilingual, and I tried to do this with my book, or show this. The individuals whose actions are described in my book, used Assyrian, Arabic, Kurdish, Turkish in their interactions with other political players, intellectuals, and state officials. Moreover, I shed a light on the 1970s, a decade that's often overlooked in Iraqi history. The focus has usually been on Saddam Hussein, his ascendancy, the Iran-Iraq war, and of course, 2003 period. So we know less about Iraq in general in the 1970s, and that's also problems because of the sources that we have, or the lack of them. I have placed an emphasis on the relations that existed between the Ba'ath regime, the oppositions, and the Assyrian community, showing a detailed analysis of the hierarchical relationship between these three entities. They're not on the same level. There's a hierarchy, right? And whatever we describe, I think we need to be aware of this hierarchy. Where do the Assyrians fall? Where do women fall? And such. But this hierarchy shows that the regime was resolved to negotiate and compromise during this early period. Of course, that changes, demonstrating the weakness of the Iraqi state in the north and within the opposition in the 70s. These types of conciliatory strategic relationships stand in stark contrast to the policies of the state in this subsequent period. And I argue it's important to study this. Why do states change their policies? Why do they negotiate at certain times? I think we learn a lot about this history. Okay. So in terms of my sources, we have seen an increase in the past decade in the way that Middle Eastern religious, ethnic, and linguistic communities defined in the modern period as minorities has shifted to include sophisticated scholarship on various communities, Armenian, Coptic, Jews of the Arab world, that challenges previously dominant notions concerning these communities in ways that have undone national, colonial, and imperial narratives. And it has turned some attention to the ways in which these narratives were formed and popularized. We have seen a shift in certain fields whereby many of these communities, the Assyrians included, were once studied through theological, classical, and linguistic lenses. Now we have them being more so examined within Middle Eastern studies as imperial subjects, as members of nation states, as exiles, as transnational actors, and most importantly, as active agents in shaping their own destinies. Most of the literature on the Assyrian community has traditionally stemmed from the linguistic and theological fields of Semitic and Syriac studies, which are important, very, very important contributions that we have done. But that focuses more on the ancient and medieval periods of Eastern Christianity and its linguistic medium of Syriac, the liturgical dialect of the Assyrian or Aramaic language used by the churches. Given the nature of the sources, this literature offers less insight into the lives and attitudes of ordinary members of the communities. And of course, there's exceptions to this as well. But usually the focus is on Syriac-speaking religious scholars and elites. Most of the studies on Middle Eastern communities, and in particular how they came to be thought of as minorities, deals with the concept of given the sources and given the approaches, inspires new ways of thinking about these communities. For my work, I describe minoritization as a historical process. So these communities were not always minorities. They were indeed indigenous communities, they are, but they have become minoritized in a historical process, creating a minority community in the 20th centuries with the creation of the nation state. Minoritization deeply is connected to sectarianism. It appears and was designed to favor certain communities, but often had devastating consequences. So basically it's describing the minoritization, the marginalization, the persecution, and the relegation of an inferior status to these communities within the hierarchy of citizenship. The living memory of violence, trauma, genocide that survivors experience often is carried with them. But my book also engages with the concept of pluralism. Rather than seeing these communities in general minorities, but the Assyrians as problems or questions, pluralism celebrates how these communities enriched the region, preserved languages, notions of homeland, historical memories, and literature in the state of pressures, displacement, and exile. So within this context, pluralism can be defined as the linguistic, cultural, and ideological integration, albeit temporary. Sometimes the integration of the community is really for a short period of time, but and within specific spaces only. And as you will see, the Assyrians came to be immersed in my period in the public sphere in the second half of the 20th century, contributing to the press and joining political parties. And then top-down structural approaches have also been assumed to be appropriate in studying various communities, including Assyrians, who have often been considered through the prism of religion, specifically their particular denomination. So when we think about Assyrians, we think about Syriac, Christian denominations, the 4 or so churches that we have that fall under the umbrella of Syriac Christianity, and we study these communities particularly within those prisons of a particular religious community, which is very problematic if you're thinking about the spaces that exist, especially with modernization and urbanization of the community, with the engagements and such. And I can say a little bit more about this in the question and answer period. The absence of the Assyrians from scholarly discussion reflects not only their omission from national archives and libraries. One of the reasons after doing my PhD work and research and working on this book itself, I became very much interested and invested in the concept, in the archival history, the collection of Assyrian archival history, because you cannot tell a new story, you cannot show a different perspective on your community, a sectarian perspective, which is, of course, that's also important. Like I said, Syriac studies, Semitic studies, the focus on particular communities and churches, that's important, but it's not a complete history. We know it. There's much more to the history of the community. And particularly their secular engagements are very much absent. But you cannot tell this history if you're not engaged in the collection of these sources, in the preservations of this history, so that you have sources, you have history. And for a historian, and I would argue for any academic, Dr. Afram, without sources, what kind of research can you do? So this is important. So the problem is not just the omission of Assyrians from national archives, but it's also the lack of language training among scholars. Of course, in Semitic studies and Syriac studies, language training is highly important. In Middle Eastern studies, not so much. You know, they know Arabic, Turkish, Ottoman Turkish, Farsi, and that's it. So if you do not learn the languages of these communities, how can you tell their history? How can you write this is the problem sometimes in studying these communities. And of course, archives, you know, of communities like the Assyrians that have been displaced, have been looted. Some are closed, some we don't have access to certain sources or certain files within certain nation states. And of course, the lack of training and the lack of work on rural communities and the disruption that those communities, the Assyrians in particular, the Yazidis as well, have seen lately, or maybe at various periods of the 20th century, really has disrupted all our knowledge and our ability to collect those sources. I'm currently engaged in projects, like I discussed yesterday, that hope to digitally preserve religious heritage, including oral and textual sources. So to show you some of the sources, my book engages with new and unexamined archival sources. I was the first from the West to do research at the Iraqi National Library and Archives in Baghdad. The library was looted, burned, but when I went there the first time in 2011, I was able to find especially police records from the 1960s pertaining to the community along with other sources. Very valuable. This is my picture with some of the ladies at the library who helped me, archivists. And I also, of course, was able to find magazines that I'll talk about in newspapers in Arabic and modern Aramaic or Assyrian that I was able to find at smaller libraries or with individual intellectuals who had larger collections. But I also used music. I also traced the movement of cassette tapes because I think, especially for a community that does not even in the homeland, and we talked about this in the when we talked about language, we're not always allowed to learn their language and standardize it. Music is very, very important, the production of cassette tapes, and I argue that's also part of the social memory and the collection of heritage that the community produces. So the chapters in my book examine the role of Assyrians in Iraq's political and intellectual movements from the 1960s to the 1980s, the factors that attracted them to various groups, and the nature of their interactions both among themselves and with other Iraqis. The fluidity that existed between Iraqi political groups engaged in similar struggles and between Assyrians as members of different groups belies the idea that communities act chiefly as homogeneous entities. There are engagements. The chapters of the book are also organized chronologically and thematically, moving between urban and rural centers. The book shows the complexity of the Assyrian experiences and the many contradictions that exist. Pluralistic engagements, integration versus separation, hierarchy, difference that continued under successive regimes of the 20th century. Focusing on the 1960s, for example, I described the ways in which Assyrians located themselves in urban centers. This is a movement, the urbanization, such as Baghdad and Kirkuk, and how they negotiated around their ethnic, religious, and socio-economic grievances. These were, as you can imagine, new rural communities that have left their home, their villages, their towns, and they were mainly workers, you know, at the very bottom of the ladder in most cases. Communities like the Assyrians, so here's an example. This is from 1957, how they basically situate themselves politically and engage. In 1959, this is a parade. This is just one image of this parade because I really love these two women in it. And they lead this is the first float of the Assyrians, but they have many, many floats. So this is 1959, just 2 decades before that, we had the Samel massacre, where another sort of celebration took place of the so-called, army that had suppressed the Assyrians in the Semel massacre came back, and they were greeted with happy crowds. Here they are in 1959 with many floats. A lot of these floats are actually created in the shapes of Babylon. The gates of Babylon have a lot of Assyrian artifacts on them, ancient Assyrian artifacts. You have a group of men actually just behind these women. You sort of see them right here. They're dressed as Assyrian soldiers, ancient Assyrian soldiers. There's like 20 of these men or so. So this is a really important showing of the community, and it shows you, this is a time when the monarchy has been toppled, and you have the first Republican rule under Qasim, who is leaning to the left and somewhat engaging with minority communities. So they find themselves in a different space. It's a positive period. Communities like the Assyrians at this time emerge from the periphery, disrupting the existing patriarchal order and igniting socioeconomic tensions. So there's tensions. Yes, this opening, this engagement in the public really brings about a lot of tensions with communities that are not comfortable with the space that Assyrians are now engaging with and politically, publicly. The tensions are mainly with Arab nationalists, with Baathists, and with conservatives, who felt particularly threatened by those affiliated with communism and the left, notably minorities and women. In 1959, we have violence erupting in Mosul and Kirkuk, and in 1963, a right-wing coup toppled the Qasim government, paving the way for the rise of the Baath Party. During the coup, a campaign of terror ensued, in which thousands of communists are killed and imprisoned, and Assyrians affiliated with the Communist Party or not were targeted. So we have Assyrian records of British archives, for instance, show that Assyrian quarters in Baghdad are targeted, women are raped, and villages outside of the city of Mosul are also targeted by the Baathist militia. Okay, so here are the police records I used from this period, 1963. If I have time, I'd love to talk about one woman, Josephine Warda, who is quite prominent. She's a leader, she's a director of the Iraqi Women's League in Kirkuk. Iraqi Women's League is a very important organization, but it's left-leaning, so they're targeted at this time because they're assumed affiliation with the communists. And, there's a lot of socioeconomic grievances. You don't like your boss, he happens to be an Assyrian. You might complain he's a communist, he will get in trouble, he will be imprisoned. So there's a lot going on. And my first chapter basically deals with this period. Okay, here's another one, Apram Barkhu, who dies in prison. The last page on this record, 1963, and he's from Kirkuk. We know that he dies in prison. We don't know exactly why, but this is a case of his. I shift the focus from urban centers to rural north during the early Republican period, 1961 to 75, and complicate the traditional understanding of the Kurdish uprising as an exclusively nationalist movement, demonstrating that Assyrians, as well as communists who survived the coup in the north, they moved to the north and become significant actors in the Kurdish uprising in their sort of collective anti-government stances. So here's an important leader from Al-Qosh, Tamo Tamas, who leads a militia. He's from Kirkuk, Al-Qosh. He works in Kirkuk, then escapes and survives. This is an image I took of him, a statue that was erected for him in 2007, a song by Talal Gresh. So he's still very much remembered, a song about him as well in 2008. Starting in 1961, Assyrians like Margaret George, I had an image of her earlier, joined the Kurdish opposition, and local Assyrian parties moved north after being denied registration in Baghdad, so Khet Alab the second, for example. As civil war continued, cooperation between the Kurds and Assyrians expanded transnationally, but the civil war had devastating consequences: depopulation of the countryside, destruction of villages, and the loss of religious and cultural sites in northern Iraq. This is before the Anfal campaign. We were experiencing this. The Baath had just succeeded in consolidating its political power in Iraq following 2 coups d'etats in 1968, wanting to increase its physical and ideological hegemony, and wary of its political opponents, the Iraqi Communist Party and the Kurdish Democratic Party, it made various short-lived concessions, including favorable policies for members of minority communities, Assyrians and Turkmens. Assyrians found themselves during this time clashing with the state, yet also motivated to collaborate with it, especially in urban centers, given the expansion of the state's resources and influence relating to oil. The Assyrians were not a direct threat to the Ba'ath Party at this time, since they lacked autonomous political representation. Their political influence was realized through their membership in the Iraqi opposition. The Assyrians were significant not only for their role within the opposition to the Ba'ath regime, but also for the transnational character they confirmed upon the opposition. During the Cold War, they employed transnational networks that benefited the community and the political entities affiliated with it, lobbying Western governments and human rights organizations through Assyrians living in the West. The state abandoned conciliatory efforts. Sorry, let me show you a few more images. This is relating to the 1960s. I talked about Toma Tomas. Here you have images of Rabban Hormuz Monastery, so a very, very important center. My second book will actually be on Al-Qosh, hopefully, and I'm starting to do research, where you have, it's a see of the Church of the East, really the Vatican of Iraq, let's say, or the Church of the East. And I noticed that there were the images or the graves of men who died fighting the Ba'athist militias, the National Guard at this time, and they're buried, we can assume, not by church officials, but by community members, right, who wanted to give them a very important sort of a holy site to be buried at. And here we see them, you know, a really important, and this is the background I was just describing to you. The Ba'ath comes to power, 68, they have lost power twice before, so they have to negotiate. They know they have to negotiate because they're not very strong. And the Assyrians are included in this negotiation because they're concerned about their role in the opposition. They're concerned about also, I mean, the first point has been argued before, but in my research on using Ba'athist archives, I saw that they were also very, very concerned about Assyrian identity, issues of Assyrian identity. It comes up in their reports, it comes up in their communication. They're concerned about Assyrian identity, the press in Iran as well. So not just in Iraq, there's a radio program that's issued in Iran, that they find out that Assyrians in the north can hear, and they try to jam the signals. So the issue of identity is also an important factor. And of course, the transnational character of the community and how the diasporic organizations have an influence on Western governments, give prominence to these groups that they're affiliated with. And negative publicity in the West is also an issue because it's a Cold War period. So this is sort of the global issue at hand. They negotiate between the Soviets and the West, but they lean towards the West. So they do not want any negative publicity about them early on. Of course, when the Iran-Iraq war begins, it's not an issue anymore. They can cover everything under the umbrella of war. They can cover their human rights abuses or their 5 minutes, okay. Their human rights abuses and destruction of villages as saying, you know, well, it's a war, they can blame it on Iran. And I argue maybe today we're using ISIS also as a scapegoat for all the problems in Iraq with minorities has to do with ISIS, but really we had issues all along, right? It wasn't, ISIS was devastating the influence on minority communities and others, but we had problems before that. So it's interesting how governments historically and today interact and use. So I have 5 minutes, I'm going to rush through this. We have a law to negotiate with the community. Law 251 is issued. What they give to the, I mean, there's negotiations with the communists and with the Kurds. Various promises are given. But the community, they give us Law 251, which is basically cultural rights. They refer to us as the speakers of the Syriac language, and they say that they are giving us a preface of this law. They are abiding by their principles of the Ba'ath Party. This is the preface from Law 251, quite significant. The words I've highlighted here, they're referring to the community as a aqalliya qawmiya, national minority. Already by the late 1970s, they have become a denomination, a religious denomination. But we can see early on, they are referred to as a national minority. Here is what we have, Mardana Turaya. Many magazines have come up, but of course I focus on this magazine for reasons that I can discuss in the question and answer period, but quite significant. I also not only look at so it's a bilingual magazine, sometimes trilingual at the very end, but early on they're published in Arabic and in Aramaic or Assyrian, and 2 generations of scholars or intergenerational divisions on identity, on gender relations, all this comes through it, and I study it for a period of 10 years. And the covers also for me are very significant, and I look at the way, and they're very creative with the images that they put on their covers. You can see with the increase in Baathification policies towards the Assyrian, especially with issues that they take with one aspect of the Assyrian identity. I mean, the Assyrian identity, to me, the way I describe it, has a number of aspects. You know, the Mesopotamian ancient heritage is important to the community. The Syriac Christian faith is important to the community. Language is a unifier, very important to the community, and the cultural traditions. The Ba'ath regime is okay with the rest, but the Mesopotamian heritage becomes suppressed. And you can see how the images, so here's an image, بين القديم والحديث, you know, progress, modernity. This cover to the in yellow here shows an ancient city, a rebuilt city, so the positive sentiments of the community. Here again, another cover which is important, one of the first one, you have the Akkadian writing in the background, and you have the Aramaic script, again connecting various aspects of the identity together. Women issues, like I said, there's an intergenerational divide. They do highlight women. The Arabic tend to be younger, writers tend to be more progressive. The Aramaic or the Assyrian tend to be older because they've had access to writing, and they're very interesting how these intellectuals know how to negotiate. They're not only speaking internally, they're speaking externally. There's this hybrid Iraqi intellectual space that it's created, and they're publishing everywhere. You know, Tariq al-Shab, the communist newspaper, Ta'akhi, they're writing everywhere about their issues, about what's important to them, and they argue using socialism, especially in Arabic, but also what I call Abbasidism, because the state, like I said, is okay with the Syriac Christian past, and they do highlight the Syriac Christian past with conferences, for example. So it's interesting how the community, the intellectuals, use what the state has accepted and used to insert what they want, insert their demands. Images, again, of this Mardana al-Turaya was the publication of an Assyrian culture club, and they had many activities. So basically, urban Assyrian intellectuals, you have subtle resistance in the press. Subtle, for instance, an interview with an important leader refers to the Semel massacre as being the raging hurricane of the 1930s. They know to push, but they know their limits. I mean, they're in Baghdad, don't forget, you know, they have to be careful. But in songs, what I call songs of defiance, the Assyrians' perspective is much more highlighted. Here's an example of a song. This is the first example that I find of the Assyrians talking about Semel from their perspective. Not the first source on the Semel. We have many sources from the 1930s. The first perspective, Assyrians talking about the Semel, how they view it as a massacre. So this young high school student, probably 18 years old or something, very courageously sings about Semel, and he uses the word massacre 11 times. 11 times. He gets in trouble, he has to leave, but it's also very significant. Again, the state negotiating an injustice corrected. What is this injustice? They don't talk about it, right? Semel is not referred, but the community, 1 minute? 1 minute, okay. Rural Assyrians continue to oppose. There's a higher committee of Christian affairs that's created. And then the Iraqi government and the opposition compete for the Assyrian community. The Iraqi government promises the community, for instance, especially in their negotiations with Malik Yaqub, to turn against the Kurds, and we will give you a region, we will give you a militia, we will give you everything. So there's competition. The Algiers agreement with Iran is a game changer because Iran stops funding the opposition, so the importance of the Assyrians becomes less significant, and then now you have more Baathification of society, destruction of villages, changes in the reversal in the policies, and very quickly, again, these are the covers. You see Mesopotamian heritage, language, the revival of the language, men. This is an image, I believe, created actually in Urmia, Iran, but it's republished here. It shows you progress, modernity, right? The people engaged in athleticism, right? So it's a positive period for the community here. And then you see, after the reversal of policies, you see the cover image, not only the content of the magazine changing, but also the cover image. Here's a fallen face on the ground. Here's an image of, Karu Sulaqa, the ascension, so more religious in nature. And then there's just a woman standing in a field, a picture of a young girl, compared to the previous very, very important, significant. And then it becomes about the Baathification of society. Saddam Hussein marching with this Mesopotamian woman leading a battlefield. So lots of changes, less resistance, less celebration of cultural language and especially Mesopotamian heritage. And the discourse is not so much dynamic in the magazine. And of course, the census information, you have to choose between being Kurd and Arab. Remember, the preface of the law referred to the community as a national minority. Here, they are just Christians, and your identity, your ethnicity is either Arab or Kurd. Destruction of villagers, the removal of and so on and so forth, and the opposition, the restarting of the opposition we have. And I continue with music as well, and how music becomes important in defying things. Underground magazine, Bahra, that's published. And the conclusion basically is that the state's economic and international standing determine the internal policies toward ethnic and confessional minorities. So a weak Iraqi state yielded cultural rights for the Assyrians. A strong Iraqi state yielded the opposite, repressive policies. And that's a conclusion for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Alda. I was sure that it was going an exciting conference in content and also in presentation. So I'm deeply thankful to you for this excellent conference. Now we have a few minutes to have some questions. We are a bit, I'm very sorry, but just I ask you to make concrete questions because immediately we'll follow or we'll deal with the next conference. Yes, Abdul Masih, please.
Thank you very much. Great book. I look forward to read it. On one slide, you depicted, let me say, competition or contradiction between the KDP and the Communist Party. The Communist Party, which was established, I think, by the Assyrian. Exactly you have shown, or at least
not another Assyrian. I mean, there are Assyrian influences, absolutely.
How did this competition play out in practice?
It shows up in Baathist archives as well, in the promises made by various groups, and the communists show themselves as being very positive towards minorities. There's probably more Assyrians drawn to the Communist Party, both urban and rural. The KDP, the Kurdistan Democratic Party, I've interviewed a lot of their early members, and they will tell you that, look, in the 1960s, we joined it because it was the active movement in the north, and we needed to also show that Assyrians care. They will argue that the KDP of the earlier period was thinking more collectively of various communities living in the north, Assyrians included, versus sort of being more nationalistic, right? So this is how they show it, and that they engaged in pushing for Assyrian rights at this. So those early members that I've interviewed. And I mean, you have statements from Mullah Mustafa Barzani, for instance, in their negotiations, asking the Americans especially for more help. And you see how, again, the rhetoric at that time historically was, we want Kurdistan, Assyrians and Kurds, always using Assyrian and Kurds in 1960s, right? But also one more thing, for the KDP especially, or the Barazanis, they're hegemonizing their power. So you have whether you're a Kurdish tribe or an Assyrian one, you have no choice eventually. Because those tribes that are not with them, Kurd or Assyrian, they do repress. They do repress them. Some have to actually leave, and Kurdish tribe have to leave and head to Iran because they're in disagreement with the Barazani. So they do hegemonize their power. They become the authority in the north, and the Assyrians, either by force or by choice, join them.
Another question?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. Alda, we're very happy with this excellent presentation, and I can't wait to read your book. We've always been sad about our intellectuals in the 50s or 60s who did not write and investigate the living sources of the genocide of 1915. You did what you could about the catastrophes that happened to our people, and they're still alive and available for you. Thank you very much for this. My question is, a lot of Iraqi Arabs and other and Muslim Iraqis suffered a lot from all these catastrophes as well. Are they very helpful to you in your finding the sources and your investigations and your analysis of the libraries, the archives that you visited? Are they helpful? And is our people, the church archives, are they open to you to investigate these?
Thank you for this question, Mate. Yes, I mean, everybody has been very helpful. I've always enjoyed my time when I go to Iraq and do research. The Iraqi National Library and Archive were very open, very helpful. Maybe if you ask certain topics that are a little bit more sensitive, it could, but not really. I did not experience any of that in certain libraries, perhaps, maybe outside of Iraq and Turkey and places like this. But in Iraq, they really, they want the international community, people from elsewhere to come and engage with their sources because they want to be open and in collaboration with others. So the community as well, very open, very, very helpful. I think your question relates more to my second book, which I'm just starting. I've been made promises by various groups that they will, religious figures as well, that they will share sources with me. They have opened the archives for me. And I believe they will deliver. I believe they will, continue to do that. There are sensitivities with what do we share, particularly relating to archives. The only archive for the community we have really is in churches. We don't have many archives. So certain things we have to collectively make decisions. For example, divorce and marriage records. I think those would be amazing to learn about social relations, gender relations. Why do people divorce? Those records I've seen, but I don't know if I'll, for instance, be able to write about because there are sensitivities. These are family records. These are people that might still be living. So do they really want, So there are certain criteria we have to look at. Various other, maybe the Vatican. How do the Vatican, for instance, shares these archives with us? Birth and baptismal records will be much more easily accessible. But I think certain sensitive issues, we will see. I think as a community, we're thinking archives. We're comfortable sharing manuscripts. Religious manuscripts, no problem, right? But anything more than that, and they're difficult questions. The community might not be comfortable with it. Imagine the archives of your great aunt and why she divorced her husband becomes public. You might not be happy with that, right? So some questions we have to answer as a community.
Yeah, please, the last question.
Thank you very much for all this information. One question, and briefly, please. I didn't hear, or maybe the time doesn't help, the period between 80 till 88. It has been occurred many issues. So can you, in brief, just give us what can you count on that period, please? Thank you.
So the 1980s, I stopped in 1988, just before the Anfal campaign, because that's a whole different thing. You cannot also cover it. So 1980 to 88, the Ba'ath regime becomes very repressive. I believe Mordana Turaya stops publishing. I think the last issue is 82. You have to check the book, maybe a little bit more, but I believe 82 they stop publishing. Really, the Ba'ath regime takes over all these institutions, even these clubs that have formed before or after Law 251. Everything becomes, there is very subtle resistance. I argue the Mordana Turaya, for example, in the Assyrian section, some poetry, you can still say people are resisting with certain things. You know, for instance, in Kirkuk, there's a celebration of Gabbarut al-Thawra, but you read the program and they have Rush Juanqa in it. Okay, so they're saying, you know, they say something, but you know, some poetry you can read and say, well, what does he mean with this poem, right? Especially in Assyrian, not so much in Arabic. In Arabic, it becomes completely the mouthpiece of the government because they have no choice. Of course, the 80 to 88 period, you know, you have persecution, very direct persecution. The Assyrian is not allowed to be used. The name Assyrian is not allowed to be used. It's a culture club. They have a lot of problems because they have the name Assyrian in their club, for example. They're called racist, chauvinistic. There's imprisonment of Assyrian leaders, the execution of Assyrian leaders at this time. Destruction of villages continues. The Iran-Iraq war begins. So society completely shifts and changes. This positive period of the 1970s, this, you know, hopefulness that Iraqis in general have, you know, diminishes. You have your men are becoming soldiers, and it's interesting. The diaspora songs by Linda George, for example. I cite a song that she has about a mother singing about her son dying in the war and how significant that is. You know, she says, I wish you had died for our cause, not for this. And why? I mean, does she not think of herself as an Iraqi? Well, it's complicated now, right? Citizenship becomes complicated. She, you know, her identity is suppressed as a mother. The community is suppressed, and so they, yes, they are Iraqis, but the hierarchy that they have fallen within is even lower today at this time. So the 1980s is a difficult period for all Iraqis, but especially for particular communities, and especially if you live in urban centers, then you really need to abide by the government line. And if you toe away from it, it's problematic. It's very problematic. It could cost you your life. So yes, the 1980s is the last chapter of the book. I have 2 chapters on the 60s, 2 chapters on the 70s. The 70s, I look at the Ba'athist archives and the Assyrian community's perspective, and I conclude with the 1980s with 1 chapter.
Thank you very much. I'm very sorry. You will ask your questions probably now because we are late, and I don't want to be without the discipline. So next, I'm very sorry, but as I told, this was going to be the last question. I'm thankful to you, Alda, for this rich and excellent presentation. And now we are going to shift to the next, or jump to the next conference, where you will be the moderator. Anahit, please come and shall I go there? Yeah. Yeah, excellent. Yeah. You can give this one to Alda. Presentation.
No, at Yerevan State University. Yerevan State.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Professor Anahit Khosroeva, a professor at Yerevan State University. She is a colleague and a friend and a really top scholar in genocide studies especially. She uses languages that many of us do not use, Armenian and Russian, and this is very, very important because she introduces archives that we don't have access to linguistically, never mind geographically. Anahit has done a lot of work to progress research on the Assyrian aspect of the genocide, or the Assyrian genocide, a topic that likely is still very much understudied, but thanks to her, we're learning a lot more about Assyrian persecution, Assyrian genocide, and what led to their displacement and targeting by state officials during the Ottoman or the end of the Ottoman period. So Anahit Khosroeva really has done a lot in terms of publications and engagements in various forums on this topic. Welcome, Anahit.
Thank you so much, Alda, for this introduction. Okay, thank you. So before I start, I believe I am the only one who during these 3 days is going to speak only half an hour. Oh, really? Thank you. No, actually, I was thinking the reason for that is because topic is very sensitive and it relates to all of us. And I'm sure whoever sits here and whoever is here, every single person, they have grandparents, parents who subjected to genocide during the Ottoman Empire and or Semele massacre, so I was thinking it's one of the reasons. But I want to take this opportunity and briefly to say thank you so much and express my gratitude to you, Malfono, Professor Afram, and to you whole your team. Teresa, Vega, Jorge, I'm sorry, I don't know all names, but thank you so much for organizing this very important and significant conference, and I hope it is going to have continuation. I appreciate it.
Just before you start, there was a small mistake in relation to the hour, but you have your time, so please.
Oh. Thank you. So I'm going to start. Crimes against humanity refer to specific crimes committed in the context of a large-scale attack targeting civilians regardless of their nationality. These crimes include murder, torture, sexual violence, enslavement, persecution, enforced disappearance, etc., and have often been committed as part of a state policies, which happened in our case, in the case of Assyrians or Assyrian genocide during the First World War. Turkish historian Taner Akçam published a book in 2012 and called it The Young Turks' Crime Against Humanity. Of course, the book is mainly about the Armenian genocide, Armenian case, but the author also includes Assyrians who, at the same time and at the same location, along with Armenians, have subjected to genocide by the Young Turks government. According to him, the Young Turks Party, the Committee of Union and Progress, had formulated prior to the First World War a policy that they began to execute in the Aegean region against the Greeks, and during the war years expanded to include the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, the Syrians, and especially the Armenians, a policy that eventually became genocidal. Next, he continues. Detailed reports were prepared outlining the elimination of a Christian population, Britain, France, and Russia initially defined Ottoman atrocities against minorities as crimes against Christianity, but later substituted humanity after considering the negative reaction that such a specific term could elicit from Muslims in their colonies. The notion crimes against humanity is recorded for the first time in Robespierre's speech at the National Council of the French Revolution, during which Louis XVI was implicated. In his account to the United Nations Secretariat, the author George Washington Williams, referring to Leopold II's tyrannical regime in Congo, the number of aborigines in Congo decreased 25% between 1880 and 1920, used the notion the king is responsible for crimes against humanity. The matter of massive crimes in the Ottoman state detained in the international community. On May 24, 1915, the countries of Entente were holding members of the Ottoman government personally responsible for ordering the killing of the Christians, assuming at the same duty and the right to indict them to justice. So, the Assyrian genocide, along with the Armenian and Greek genocides, was the first intent ethnic cleansing and mass extermination of the 20th century, which occurred in the Ottoman Empire during the First World War from 1914 to 1918. Hundreds of thousands of Assyrians perished as a result of execution, deportation, starvation, diseases, the harsh environment, and physical abuse. The systematic manner in which the massacres and slaughters of Assyrians was conducted, along with the documented intentions of Turkish leaders and sheer number of individuals murdered, demonstrate that the Turkish government planned and, to a great extent, succeeded in fulfilling a policy of genocide toward the Assyrian people. With the criminal connivance of the world's major powers and taking opportunity presented by the martial law, Turkey committed the gravest crime against humanity: genocide. Genocide is the crime of destroying or attempting or conspiring to destroy a national, ethnic, or religious group, whether in whole or in a part. The First World War was an ideal context in which Ottoman state could accomplish this goal. The war not only absorbed the resources and focus of the world's major powers, but it also created a morally ambiguous atmosphere where brutality and death on a massive scale could be justified or trivialized. The Assyrians, whose Christian identity and cultural durability were perceived by Turkish nationalists to be undesirable obstacles to the realization of a pan-Turkic nation, found themselves barriers of a misfortune with reverberations lasting to this very day. The professional investigation of the anatomy of the Ottoman Empire by a lot of the worldwide scholars let us deduce that the latter bore crime and genocide, and topologically could be categorized as a genocidal state. The Ottoman state system, with inclination to ethnic cleansing and genocide, had provided itself with an adequate concept, a theoretical foundation for the preparation and perpetration of, in our case, the Assyrian genocide. Nevertheless, the suffering of the Assyrians is largely forgotten internationally and not recognized as genocide, which embitters the descendants of the victims. Our grandparents faced the menace of total physical extermination in the name of bringing about the dream of the young Turks to create a pure Turkish state. The genocidal quality of the murderous campaigns against not only the Armenians, but also Assyrians and Greeks, it's obvious. The destruction of these free Christian communities was one aspect of the homogenizing process when a modern state, with its destructive power out of ideological radicalization, identified part of its own civilians as undesirable. The massacres, slaughters, ethnic cleansings, and all kinds of atrocities of the Assyrians which took place at the end of the 19th century and during the First World War in the Ottoman Empire were clearly a form of genocide, the contemporary term for any attempt to destroy a national, ethnic, or religious group in whole or in a part. And the genocide of Assyrians was by no means accidental or unexpected. It logically derived from the brutal and nationalistic policy pursued by the Turkish sultans and later the Young Turks against the non-Turkish nations during the preceding decades. It was not a policy of individuals, but an official state policy, which included persecution and carnage. The field of genocide studies has grown rapidly in the recent years, fueled by interest in the Armenian genocide, the international criminal tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and widespread massacres in Darfur, and of course the terrorist attacks in Iraq and Syria by ISIS against the Yazidis and Christians, and by Christians in this case I mean of course the Assyrians. While 1,000 comparative studies of the Armenian genocide and the Jewish Holocaust have been published, and a quite number of such studies also address genocide in Cambodia, Bosnia, and Rwanda, none of these works devotes much analysis to the experience of other victims of genocide. During the past decade or so, few dozen of studies were published not only by the Assyrian researchers, but also by foreign historians and genocide scholars, where the mass extermination of the Assyrians by the Ottoman or Turkish government was qualified as an organized criminal policy. It was confirmed by the various types of sources and documents kept in the national archives of different countries. Certainly, despite all this, nowadays Republic of Turkey, successor of the Ottoman Empire, doesn't adjust to historical facts and pursues genocide denial policy at the state level. The damages and losses of the Assyrians during the perpetration of the Assyrian genocide and the consequences of the non-elimination can be conditionally divided into the following groups. Basically, I am trying to show what we got during and after genocide. So it's a deprivation from their homeland, human losses, cultural heritage loss, financial losses, mental disorders and physical complexes, and trauma. I'm going to get back for this again at the end of my speech, but continuing, one of the first tasks of the Assyrians after the Great War was to make a claim for self-determination along the principles of United States President Woodrow Wilson. A first reaction asserted, no nation in modern history has suffered as much as our nation. We have endured our massacres silently. Though the 1920 Treaty of Surayt gave hope to the surviving Assyrians scattered across British Iraq, Persia, French Syria by offering a scheme of local autonomy for the predominantly Kurdish areas, with full safeguards for the protection of the Assyro-Chaldeans and other racial or religious minorities within these areas. However, often conflicting political interests of London, Paris, Rome, and Moscow combined with the 1919 revolution led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk ensured the Assyrian claim for autonomy guaranteed by the League of Nations and the great powers never materialized. The 1920 Treaty of Lausanne didn't include special protections for Assyrians, nor did it even record the Assyrians as an official minority group. The feeling of international neglect did have some basis, in fact. For instance, the voluminous report of Lord Bryce and Arnold Toynbee to the British Parliament devoted 100 pages to the Assyrians, but this was fully obscured by the title given it, the treatment of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. Some of the earliest massacres perpetrated by the Ottoman army were on a mixed assembly of Assyrians and Armenians in northwest Iran. News about the early atrocities played an important part in the Allied threat to persecute the Turkish government for crimes against humanity and civilization. However, after this first burst of attention paid to the suffering of Assyrians, the amount of newspaper coverage declined as the killings stopped in Iran, only to continue more intensely in Turkish dark interior, fast disappearing from sight. Much of the international newspaper coverage was dependent on letters from eyewitnesses and diplomats, and the Turks enforced strict censorship. The Armenians did have their own news centers in European countries and could give a steady flow of information, but the Assyrians lacked communication channels and depended on foreign mission organizations. Lack of accessible documents delayed the start of historical research and even the suffers from partial coverage of events inside the Ottoman Empire. So, as I said, I'm going back to points which I noticed, and I'm going to go very shortly one by one. So, the deprivation of Assyrian people of its homeland, the geographical map, land in eastern Turkey or western Armenia, and I hate to call it Anatolia by Turkish name, where they used to live by centuries, I consider the deprivation or impoverishment of homeland. And it is the main loss of the Assyrian genocide, of course, after the human losses. Meanwhile, for the perpetrators of the genocide, it was the most significant and important reason and goal of committing that crime. The disposition of the Assyrians from their homes and agricultural lands, moreover, tended to deprive them of the conditions necessary for bare life, let alone a civilized or dignified life, group as such. As it is about the loss of major part of the territories where Assyrians lived, so it is necessary to clarify the consequences it had and how it has touched upon the further functioning and development of the Assyrians. Unfortunately, indigenous people are often massacred and deported from valuable lands during wars, valorized by their persecutors as divinely inspired or mandated. The human losses of the Assyrian people after the genocide is considered 3/4 of whole population. However, when clarifying the number of human losses, the number of Assyrians who have been Islamized during the genocide should also be taken into account. Like yesterday, Nicholas was speaking about it. These people also considered as human losses because as a result of this assimilation process, they have stopped to consider themselves Assyrians. Also, let's not forget that the Assyrian girls and women were taken unlimited times to Turkish and Kurdish households or harems, both during 1895, 1896, and also during the First World War, in different provinces, mainly in Diyarbakir and Van. Psychological complexes after the genocide of the Assyrians has acquired many physical complexes and fears that have negatively affected their future activities. The psychological consequences of the Assyrian genocide directly and indirectly affected and continue to affect not only the survivors of the genocide, and here I'm not talking about the First World War survivors, but also Somali massacres, which still we have people who live, but also the next generation, such as us. Speaking on financial losses, I am sure we don't have any complete research done on this issue. But as I said yesterday, in Armenian, Russian, and also Georgian national archives, we have documents, and if we can put all together, I'm sure we can have a number how much financial losses we had during the genocide. Loss of cultural heritage. The perpetration of the Assyrian genocide caused huge cultural losses to the Assyrian people. Hundreds of monuments, artifacts, churches, monasteries, chapels were destroyed and ruined. The expression of cultural genocide against Assyrians should also be considered the destruction of thousands of Syriac manuscripts. In his autobiography, Totally Unofficial Man, Raphael Lemkin, who coined the word of genocide, recalled the struggle to pursue the United Nations to recognize cultural genocide. This concept, wrote Lemkin, meant the destruction of a cultural pattern of a group, such as the language, the traditions, the monuments, archives, libraries, churches. In brief, the shrines of the soul of a nation. The Assyrian people have been struggling for recognition and condemnation of a genocide committed against them for the past few decades. Through that period, the few parliaments, as legislative bodies and international organizations in different countries, adopted the resolution recognizing and condemning the Assyrian genocide, which is extremely important as they have been given a principal assessment of what happened to the Assyrians at the beginning of the 20th century, describing as genocide and pointing out at the same state that committed the crime. However, despite all this, Turkey continues to deny the crime committed against the Assyrians at the state level. Furthermore, this the greatest unpunished genocide of the modern era stands out from other genocide due to continuing denial which has been transformed into an instrument of power. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the biggest criminal, a few years ago described the persecution of Muslims in Myanmar as genocide, said that in 2009 that it is impossible for Muslims to commit genocide. In these conditions, it became clear that fighting for international recognition of Assyrian genocide cannot be finalized, and the time has come to overcome the consequences of this crime and for reparation. Of course, a lot has to be done by us. International recognition and condemnation of Assyrian genocide still continues because it is the most serious crime known to humanity. Hopefully, the new countries are going to condemn it. The pressure of the international community and the Turkish Progressive Society will sooner or later lead to the recognition of the genocide against the Assyrians by the Republic of Turkey and overcoming the consequences of that crime. Beyond any discussion on the crime of genocide denial, it appears essential for our modern society not to forget the fact that hundreds of thousands of humans beings have been hatefully exterminated in the course of the 20th century because of their ethnic or religious group. Genocide is a highly political act, and therefore genocide prevention cannot be but a political response. Genocide cannot happen without the willful neglect of states that could otherwise counter or prevent it. It is hardly a matter of debate that the prevention of genocide and mass atrocities requires the international community's concert efforts and cooperation. Preventing genocide is not a task of a single state, but that of a network of a collectivity. Genocide prevention therefore requires more than a group of non-genocidal states for whom genocide massacres of populations seems to be a distant reality. It requires a network of anti-genocidal states that are proactively and collectively engaged in carrying out the mandate of sovereign state to survive their citizenry. An effective model of a transnational cooperative network of genocide prevention is still far from being operational. Past experiences of genocide and mass atrocities clearly indicate that a period of gradually intensifying polarization and animosity between the group over a span of years or even decades usually precedes the rapid escalation into mass killing. So, the international community failed to prevent the Assyrian genocide, certainly the Armenian and Greek genocides along, largely due to the lack of preventive mechanism and the crisis of international order at the time. More than a century on, however, the ability of international community to properly identify and react to crime against humanity is still being considerably challenged. It has been said too many times before, the crimes unpunished lead to recurrence and repetition. More often than not, at the heart of the crimes against humanity is a history of continued violation of fundamental human rights. The Assyrian genocide is still an open wound for its people, an unfinished chapter in world history, for the guilty party has yet to receive the punishment it deserves. Basima Rabba, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, dear Anahit, for this really excellent presentation. And we have about how much time? We have time for question and answer. So you need to come to the front if you don't mind. Anyone? Mate?
Yes, I have a question. Can I stay here for...
Thank you very much, Anna. We're very happy with this presentation. Excellent summarizing of what happened to us in 1916. We've organized several genocide events in the past on a cultural association levels, not as professional as you did. Obviously, we're very glad someone like you could put it at that level, finally. We noticed, however, with our engagement with our Armenian friends, that some of them were unhappy of us using the date, a similar date, to call it the Assyrian genocide in April, and they were very reluctant and hesitating to have this recognition as well. So I was very glad to see that Armenia has recognized it. Have you met similar experiences?
Thank you so much for the question. Yes, I absolutely agree with you. Unfortunately, yes, there is that kind of, yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but my question is very related, so it would be much easier.
Sure, go ahead, sure.
Well, thank you again for your presentation. So yeah, just recently the Armenian did recognize the Assyrian genocide as well. But when a country recognizes a genocide, it has this role to raise awareness, to spread awareness to other countries. But just recently when the Armenian officials applied these official documents to the US, they didn't mention the Assyrian genocide to them, and hence when the US did recognize the Armenian genocide, the Assyrians were not included, and I think this was marginalizing of the Assyrian genocide, even though the Armenian government has recognized it. So I need to know what is your thoughts about it and why this kind of thing is happening. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I totally understand, and I believe like I'm the only one whoever answer on this question, so it's not going to be blamed from both sides. So being half Armenian, half Assyrian, I'm sure like I have that confidence to answer from both sides. So first question, yes, I know that the Armenians are not very happy that but especially with tendencies going inside, not inside the Armenia. Inside the Armenia, they already know, and it's very clear, based and default, that during the genocide, free Christian nations, being a religious minority, were subjected to genocide. But outside Armenia, so, people are different. I cannot speak for them, especially considering their political parties and the issues which they have together, so I cannot tell for them, but of course it's very wrong. And inside Armenia, we tell the same thing. Like my professor, when I was going for my PhD, he was saying, when I was proving them that Assyrian genocide was not only slaughter, was not the ethnic cleansing, so all the factors which we are saying pointing, so everything matches to genocide, so it is genocide, it's not a massacre. Every time they were confronting me saying, no, it is not a genocide. It cannot be the same level like Armenian genocide. So it really takes a lot of effort to prove. So, and I remember that my mentor, he said, you know what, right now you are behaving like Jews, because Jews tell for Armenians, our was a genocide, what's your genocide cannot compare with our genocide. So now whatever you do for Assyrians, you are telling the same thing. So for the past 15, 20 years, I can tell things changed a lot, and so I'm really happy for that. And also for recognition. Of course, in 2015, Armenia finally recognized the Assyrian genocide, and I'm really happy for that, because when we were fighting for this cause, we were saying, you know that our people, with your people subjected to genocide. Basically, and sometimes they were ordered, because there are Turkish documents from Talat Pasha, which says, right now, don't touch any national minorities except Armenians. So, but it says, but Assyrians, knowing that they're going to be next one after Armenians, so they were fighting with brothers Armenians, so they got subjected to genocide also. So it's one of the reasons. So finally Armenia recognized, and for Biden, of course, I cannot tell, Biden, he signs whatever they give him, but let's accept that it's also our fault. We have to work. Armenians working on this cause from 1965. We started just recently, and we have to work a lot. Recognition doesn't come from nowhere. You have to work for this cause so you can have the results.
Thank you. You indicated that there are sources, Russian, Armenian, Georgian sources that are not yet accessible and translated. What does it take to collect them and translate them and make them available?
It takes, yesterday we were speaking about the same problem. So we need scholars, at least students, who can read and the same languages, because there are documents in Assyrian, there are documents in Georgian, Armenian, and Russian. So we need people who can read this language and they can translate it, and it has to be digitalized. So we need people, and we need not only scholars, they can be as students also to come to work.
If I was just trying to say, of course, we will have in the research groups that we are starting to create, specific fields will be for sure included in the Nineveh Chair for the next future. So we have been focusing now on language, history, and culture. And in the history, whether we want or not, genocide is part of it. So there will be a specific part dedicated, the resources of the Nineveh Chair will be dedicated to this part of history as well. Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Anahit, thank you very much for this presentation. It always touched me a lot. It hurts a lot still. I was wondering if we can, the Semele genocide, call it a genocide. I know there are no much research about it. Is that something you can pick up or with a group or whatever? Because that's not very, very long time ago. And whatever we can find, we can use it for the political statements in the future.
Thank you so much for your question. Yes, absolutely. You know, I consider like with at the end of the 19th century, when it was Sultan Abdul Hamid's massacres, we lost 55,000 population. So that was a pre-genocidal time. So basically they knew what they're planning to do. They were preparing us for the main genocide. Main genocide happened during Young Turks Revolution, after revolution during World War I. And genocide, Somali massacres, I always compare it, I say it's out of frying pan into fire. So immediately from the genocide, they just jumped to another genocide. Basically, our people, they took a refuge to Bakuba camps, so thinking they are going to have their autonomy under British protectorate and things like that. So, but you know, they subjected to genocide again. And yes, all the points of genocides, which we can say it's a massacres, it's cleansing, and number, it's no matter. So definitely it was a genocide.
Thank you, Anahit, for your presentation. It was very informative. You talked about the perpetual state of denial on the part of Turkey. And I have a question, because, of course, it's not only, let's say, the adults that perpetuate this denial. It's also, I think, or at least that's what I heard from other people, that they don't even mention, of course, the genocide in the books, like in school, for example. So they perpetuate this idea also at a elementary level, let's say. So I would like to ask you if you know a little bit more about that, because I heard like a story, for example, don't quote me on it, please. In court, it would be probably something like hearsay, but for example, they talk about a walk into a desert or something, and I mean, that's just terrible. So.
And you're asking from Turkey's side, right?
Yeah, like what do they teach in the history books in Turkey?
Yeah,
because
of course. I mean, it's not on for their benefit or profit, and denial is there. So not only they are not speaking in their history, not only in their books, but also all the documents in Turkish archives, almost all the documents, whatever they could, they burned it. Like whatever right now we find any kind of document, we find by mistake. So it means like somehow it like appeared in like between the documents or between the books. Otherwise there is no any proof. So they committed the genocide. Because, I mean, it was coming from the Ministry of Interior, from Talat Pasha. He was one who was responsible for the killing Armenians, Assyrians, and Greeks. But nowadays, like right after the war finished and they had their defeat, so immediately first thing they did, they burned their documents. So of course it's not working on their benefit. And it's not only a matter of a genocide to tell, okay, we are apologizing like Germany did it. If also compensation is working. And as I said, from the perspective point of Armenians, they lose their homeland. And basically I consider we lost our homeland also, because Hakkari Mountains and, you know, and also part of which it goes to Urmia, 70,000 people, they were living, Assyrians, they were living there. And I'm not talking about like Hakkari and Botan and in the Diyarbakir. So these are the lands which our people, they were living for centuries. So I believe so, and I am like very confident that we lost part of our homeland also, and we have to claim it. And why they don't recognize it? Because they know they have to pay for it. They have to return it. It's not only a matter of, oh, we are apologizing. I'm sorry, we did a genocide. No, it's not like that. You have to pay for it. There is a compensation. So hopefully one day we will get there. I don't know. But we have to work a lot. It doesn't come like out of nowhere. Especially nowadays, nobody grants land. Just take it, it's yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Now, after the presentation, this excellent conference, there was a still mistake, but we have used the time to cover the whole hour. Now we are going to have a coffee, and then we will come back for the next session. Just, I would like to know who is leaving after lunch. Is somebody leaving? No, thank you. No, because we have prepared your certificates of attendance and so on. Who? Is he leaving? Yeah. Okay. So I will. We will have. Yeah. He has been here. Then he gone out. Okay. If it's just one, it's okay. We will have then the chance to provide him with the certificate that we have prepared for this special session. Now let's go again and have a coffee, because I think it's good to, after these two important conferences, to recover a bit of such huge information that we have had. Thank you very much again.
Hey,